So to do either, to thus either say there is a theory but I'm not sure about it and I need to test it, or to say I don't know what's going on and I'm building a theory, you need to draw on methodological approaches. So this method in the scientific sense is a systematic approach based on generalized rules and that allows some sort of scientific inquiry, be it again theory building or theory testing. Now we're moving a bit more to an empirical approach now, because this is a course about quantitative methods, and of course qualitative work is often very empirical, and we know that, so that's a misunderstanding that many people have, that empirical is necessary quantitative. That's not the case. But the empirical approach then would argue, okay, if we really want to advance our knowledge, if we really want to come to a better understanding, we can only do so through observation and experience. For an empirical approach, a theory purely based on argumentation or intuition is not a theory, it's not a valid theory. So an empirical approach asks for substantiating your theoretical model through observation. Again, that observation could be qualitative or quantitative observation, but it's observation that is important here to come to better knowledge about the social reality, more valid knowledge about the social reality. Now note that this empirical science approach is also only a theory, and there would be many others arguing that it's not the only and not the only valid theory. But that's the theory that we're basically drawing on when we talk about quantitative methods, that we assume that we can only validate what we think about the reality out there by drawing on observations of anything. This brings us now a bit to this, again, empirical could be qualitative or quantitative. And that's an important decision to take when you plan your own research project. Where do I position myself? Unfortunately, often that decision is taken by experience. I never did quantitative science, so I'm rather doing a qualitative study. That's what I often hear from master students that want to write their master thesis, right? They come with an idea, they have a research question, and then they ask me, so how do we want to do it? I don't like stats, so I'm rather doing qualitative work. That's not the way how you should decide these things. If you've got a question, there is most likely going to be a method which is more appropriate, or an approach which is more appropriate than the other one. So your question should determine your approach and not your experience and your abilities determine your approach. And that's something which is, I think, important when we now discuss the quantitative-qualitative divide. I thought this was a nice start into the topic. So here the quantitative guy asks, only 1 in 30 take the free ice cream. Interesting. And the qualitative guy asks, so what did you feel when you saw the free ice cream? Well, I was excited, a little bit scared. And so why was that? It's not a... It's maybe a nice illustration of... here we're interested in generalizations, in quantifications, in maybe the bigger picture of things. Here we are interested in a single individual and dig deeper into his motivations and reasons for certain behaviors. And it's not the best illustration, but it's a good first illustration, I think, of the differences. And we'll continue with such differences in a way. So we use qualitative research to develop initial understandings of a problem, to look for a range of ideas about something. We try to understand different perspectives and categories of peoples and come to a deep understanding of those differences, for instance. Uncover underlying motivations. There's no theory yet that would tell us anything about underlying motivations. We try to uncover them first of all before we go into quantitative measurements. And sometimes, and this is an important point for this course also, qualitative research provides impetus provides information for the design of a quantitative study. So you have qualitative pre-studies that you're going to draw on in order to design your quantitative study. Sometimes also qualitative research is needed to explain findings from quantitative research. So you've got the big picture, but you still don't understand what it actually means, and then you add qualitative components to what you're actually doing. Quantitative research, by contrast, recommends find course of action, find consensus, projects results to a larger population, which is something we'll talk about tomorrow. Sampling and to what degree we can actually generalize to bigger populations. Identify evidence for cause and effect relationships. Again, something which would be very hard with qualitative approaches, but with an experimental approach, for instance, very, very easy to do, to clearly show cause and effect relationships. Describe characteristics of groups of people, and then of course test specific hypotheses, test theories and their validity overall. So that's one way how you could position those approaches to each other. And you see that, they start speaking to each other. You need the qualitative to establish or to design or to interpret the quantitative. You need the quantitative maybe to test the theories that you came up with in the qualitative. So in that sense, often we're working on either side of the bridge, and some of you explicitly said you don't want to do that, but many projects could benefit from triangulation between both types of approaches. I'll have more of these because it's very easy to contrast a few things here, and just to make the difference a bit clearer. So qualitative research, what's the purpose? We understand we interpret social interactions, whereas quantitative research tests the hypothesis, look at cause and effect, make predictions. That's very different things, right? They might be relating to the same theoretical framework. You could use the same theoretical background doing both. But this purpose is different from this purpose. The N, the number of subjects that you're using in your research, and whether it's content analysis, interviews, and so on and so forth. Normally here, quite small, not randomly selected in a way. Here, larger and often at least randomly selected to make statements about bigger populations. Variables, there's no variables in qualitative studies. You study the whole. You want to understand the whole. You don't want to chuck up the whole into different parts. Whereas in quantitative, we usually study variables. So we're looking at very precise little segments of that reality that we're interested in and pull those out for our studies. Types of data, words, images, objects are examples of types of data here, whereas in quantitative we usually use numbers and then statistics to make sense of those numbers. Forms of data, here rather open-ended responses, observations. Here it's using precise measurement, and we'll get to that in the second lecture today, precise measurement of what we're interested in. Identifying patterns, identifying statistical relationships. Once we've got numbers and figures, we want to do statistics with that in order to interpret these numbers. Here, the research objective is about exploring, discovering, constructing. Here, about describing, explaining, and predicting. Keep that in mind also for later when we talk about research questions. What's my question about? What's actually the interest of my research question? And how does that reflect with these different approaches? Or how do I have to reformulate my research question to, since we're doing quantitative research in this course, make it fit better with this side of the table? Focus wide angle versus rather narrow angle of the quantitative. So what we'll be doing here is, in the next couple of days, we'll talk about sampling, which is one big issue in quantitative approaches and an important issue. We'll talk about types of data, and numbers and statistics, and how they come about. And we'll talk about the precision of measurement and validation and the different types of measurement instruments involved. This again, another table. Quantitative evaluates, quant counts measures, qualitative uses concepts, and quantitative processes data. This is very much com-focused, so this is about aesthetics in text, and indices, theoretical statistical, interprets, describes. These are all very blunt differentiations. And I think often, if you look at it more concisely, the truth might be lying a bit more in the middle and not on these extreme poles. But just to make clear where we are, and just to enable you to position yourself, if you want so, as a quantitative researcher, I think it's quite useful to actually use these blunt, polarizing types of tables. This is something I refer to in the few words I said in the inaugural lecture. So in a quantitative research design, often the interpretation is being attacked. Why did you interpret it this way and not this way? How do you come? What's the role of the researcher in qualitative research and researcher bias in these kinds of research? Whereas in quantitative research, it's often the methodology which is attacked. You didn't measure well. Your measurement is not reliable. Your experimental setup doesn't make sense. Your stimulus material is flawed, and so on and so forth. Which is also an interesting observation that, with quantitative research, once you have your results, and they are based on a good methodology, it's very hard to critique those results. Whereas here, it's usually the results that are being critiqued, because they are part of a less systematic, objective type of approach. And that's something we'll certainly be talking about next days. Very briefly again, so since this course is about quantitative methods, use these tables to try to reflect on your own positioning and your research purposes. Very briefly, what are some of the common benefits but also disadvantages that are attached to quantitative research? So the benefits. Quantitative approaches allow for studying broader issues, maybe greater number of subjects, and usually should come up with some sort of generalizable results. We'll see in the next days that generalizability is not always given, and there's serious limits also in terms of generalizability. But the aim of a good quantitative study should be to come up with something which applies broader than just the specific context that the study looks at. So even if I do an experiment with college students, as psychologists would very often do, the assumption is that those findings of that experiment travel beyond the population of US college students, for instance, which is often the population, right? And we'll critically discuss to what degree that is actually a good assumption. Allegedly, results from quantitative studies allow for greater objectivity and accuracy of the results. We'll try to make sure that in quantitative approaches our results are objective, that any researcher doing the same study with the same design would come to the same conclusions, which would not necessarily be the case in qualitative approaches, where different researchers very well could come to very different conclusions, which would be fine, which would be also transparent. And in order to achieve this so-called objectivity, we need transparency in methods, and we need systematic methods, and we need to come to some of the quality criteria that we discussed in a little bit: reliability, validity, and so on and so forth. Because only by working in such a way we can come to a situation that we can argue that our results are objective. And I'm not going into the discussion of whether true objectivity can actually be achieved. What we call it objectivity because we all have a sense of what it is, and much more correctly we would call it intersubjectivity. Different subjects, different researchers in different contexts would come to the same results, which still doesn't mean that that's a picture of objective reality, but at least we all come to agree on this. benefit is that in quantitative designs we often can, based on theory, reduce our models, our ideas of reality out there to a few variables and look at many cases and thereby come to and we use procedures that again ensure validity, reliability, so these data that are generated for these few variables and in many cases should be valid and reliable, thus either subjective or objective. Research can be replicated. Again, that's a very important point that proponents of quantitative designs always bring up again. It's important that research in different scenarios should come to fairly similar conclusions, because what's the worth of the theory behind the approach, right? We have a theoretical assumption. You do your study here, I do my study in Austria. We find very different things. What does that mean? Is the theory not valid, or do we have to think about what we did methodologically, or is it difference between India and Austria that that causes these differences? There is interesting research in psychology going on at the moment about the replication of psychological experiments, where the findings are quite worrisome, and I forgot the exact numbers, but a lot of psychological experiments, a big group of researchers tried to replicate psychological experiments in different countries, in different settings, and the worrisome finding was that only about 30% of the experiments could be replicated in terms of coming to similar conclusions, which is really scary if you think about it. You know, and we're talking about well-established experiments published in good journals and so on and so forth. The more thorough we are in terms of designing our study, the easier it should be to transfer it to different contexts. Difficult issue. Personal bias can be avoided. As quantitative researchers, we usually step away from our research subjects and try to not interfere with the methodology and the design. We'll come to situations during the next days where that's very difficult to do, but we'll at least try to do that. So, summarizing, quantitative methods allow us to summarize vast sources of information and facilitate comparative comparison over time. That's the last point here. What are some of the disadvantages, though? And certainly there's many disadvantages in narrow and sometimes superficial data set. So, sorry, looking again at you. You want to tell me that you study Indian elections by looking at a survey with 50 variables. Whereas, you know, reality is so much more complex than 50 variables. That's a very easy critique, which you have to counter by saying, but I picked the 50 ones that I think are the most important ones, and at least try to explain a lot of what I can explain. But indeed, a quantitative approach will never fully explain social reality. And for those of you familiar with statistics, you know in your regression models, if you have explained variance of 50%, happy days. Happy days. But that means that another 50% of the variance is unexplained. In media effect studies, an area that I'm working in, I'm usually, I'm happy with when my media effects explain 2, 3, 4% of the variance. I'm usually quite happy, because that means yes, I did add to understanding of what's out there. I only added 4% of understanding what's out there, but I did add. And if we all add our little bits and pieces, we might come to situations where, we can explain 60, 70, 80%. Results are limited as they provide numerical descriptions rather than detailed narrative, and generally provide less elaborate accounts of human perception. Yes, that's pretty much what I was just trying to tell you. Yes, that's true. And as a quantitative researcher, I have to acknowledge that that's true. When I then write up my conclusion section about the media effects, I should not say that media effects are determining everything out there. I should be very much aware that my media effects are just a small slice of that reality. But that's the one I'm interested in. That's the one I'm studying. Quantitative research often takes place in an unnatural, artificial environment. Yes, that's true. That's true for almost all of the we do. Experiments, certainly. You know, you ask people to come into a lab and fill in questionnaires and look at stuff on a computer screen that they normally would never look at. Very artificial. Nothing to do with how they normally would consume the news, in my case, for instance, when we do experiments about that. What does that actually tell us about reality? Be aware of the fact that that's the case. And we'll get back to that when we do experiments. Surveys. Surveys requires people to give an attitude measure. Do you like party X? How much do you like party X? Yeah? At the moment, when you ask them, you give someone a survey, that person might not have thought about politics for a week, that might not have thought about politics for another week, or never in their lifetime. But at that moment, you ask them to give them a concrete assessment from 1 to 10 about a political party. Very unnatural, something we would never do. You'd never go to your colleague and say, hey, have you thought about party X, and how would you rate them on a scale from 1 to 10? You know? Not commonly occurring. So yes, true. Often what we do is very unnatural, and again, we need to be aware of the fact that that's the case, and what that actually means when we interpret our results. And we can maybe work on this and maybe try to come up with situations where the environment is a bit more natural. For instance, we now do a lot of online experiments, you know. You could at least say, okay, at least people are sitting at home and consume the thing on their own computer, which is coming to, you know, studies on perceptions of social media. A couple of you want to do stuff on social media. Perceptions of social media, right? It's nice that people, also if it's a fake Facebook account that you're showing them, at least see it in their own home, on their own screen, in the same environment as they would normally consume Facebook.